Hi, everybody. Today we are going to discuss the peripheral nervous system, with our focus being on the autonomic nervous system, the two branches being sympathetic and parasympathetic. So let's go ahead and get started. So peripheral nervous system, we have learned previously that it has two main branches. The two branches are known as the sensory, also known as the afferent division, and the motor division, which is the efferent branch. We have discussed in detail the sensory in terms of your common senses, your vision, your auditory, gustatory, vestibular, etc. We discussed them in terms of your central nervous system and how does that data gets processed. The focus today would be on motor, but more specifically on the branch we identify as the autonomic branch of our nervous system. Now, again, just kind of recalling, motor can be somatic as an voluntary motor control versus autonomic, controlling either your smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or release of gland, release of solutions from glands, or release of hormones from your glands. Now, when we're talking about somatic nervous system, this is a very simplified version. We will discuss this in more detail when we talk about muscular system and the neuromuscular junction. But to give you an idea, here is you have your neuron, kind of identifying the structure again, starting from the central nervous system, very long axon, hence we use the word nerve fibers for these. And at the axon terminal of these neurons, they are going to release a specific neurotransmitter referred to as acetylcholine, which is a shorthand to ACH. Now, if we are talking about somatic motor, again, the only type of things that we can bind to would be your skeletal muscle. Here is a really important aspect of this, guys. Right now, we're talking about voluntary motor control of the muscles, which are going to be your skeletal muscle. So these neurotransmitter ACH, when they get released, they interact or bind to specific receptors on the surface of the skeletal muscle, which are categorized as nicotinic receptors. So ACH binding with nicotinic receptors leads to the process we identify as muscle contraction. And again, we'll go into detail about this when we talk about neuromuscular junction later on. That's all you need to know in terms of somatic nervous system. What is the neurotransmitter that is activating the system? What type of receptors they bind to, and the fact that these movements will be identified as voluntary motor control. Now, when we're talking about autonomic nervous system, we have a much wider discussion in terms of the parts of the brain that are involved and also the parts of the body that get affected through the autonomic branching of the nervous system. So some of the centers for the autonomic control include hypothalamus, which controls the water balance, basically your thirst response, hunger, as well as temperature balances. So maintaining your homeostasis for these three main components are done by your hypothalamus. Furthermore, you have your pons that are identified as a secondary respiration center. So if you are still don't remember this from our previous lecture, pons is identified as secondary respiration centers. Versus medulla oblongata would be your primary respiration center, primary cardiac center, which basically control your blood pressure as well as your heart rate. And then medulla oblongata also has control over your involuntary actions like vomiting, swallowing, coughing, hiccuping, etc. And you guys can see specifically what part of the medulla oblongata and pons are responsible for these actions. I don't expect you guys to learn about this in detail in terms of identifying the locations specifically. However, I do want you guys to be able to answer the questions regarding primary, secondary respiration center or primary cardiovascular center. Now, we already have a familiarity with autonomic nervous system and the fact that it has two branches. We have the sympathetic branch and the parasympathetic branch. Sympathetic branch, we learned before, is identified as fight or flight response, correct? And your parasympathetic is known as rest and digest, or another name for it is housekeeping. We mentioned that it's sometimes also called the, when you're using your parasympathetic activity, especially right after you ate a heavy meal, what we call as food coma. Now here is basically the depiction again. Rest and digest is parasympathetic. When you're relaxed, your focus might be shifted to your digestive processes versus when you are dealing with the sympathetic branch, you're focused more on dealing with the stress, anxiety, or a condition that is going to activate your fight or flight response. So autonomic branches of the nervous system, which are the sympathetic and parasympathetic, have association with the spinal cord. So the nerves that are coming out of the spinal cord are located in different regions, and I'll show you in the next picture in just a minute. The neurotransmitters that are released in preparation of the activation of the sympathetic versus parasympathetic are different in some parts and identical in others when you're comparing the two branches. The receptors which interact with the neurotransmitters varies from the two branches of sympathetic and parasympathetic. And so does the effect on the target tissue when such receptors are activated by the neurotransmitters. And again, we'll talk about this. There's tables at the end of this PowerPoint that will go over in terms of some of the main changes or variation you see when you have your fight or flight active versus when you have your rest and digest active. So what do you need to know for this picture? The main information I need you to know is that if you are describing the sympathetic branches of the nervous system, and then say what part of the nervous system is associated with the sympathetic branch, the main neurons that, or the main nerves that are associated with that are originating from the thoracic region, so T1 through T12, as well as the first two lumbar nerves, L1 and L2. So sympathetic nervous system is highly directly initiated from the spinal nerves. On the other hand, when we look at the parasympathetic nervous system, notice we have involvements of both the cranial nerves as well as the spinal nerves. So cranial nerves that are involved in this process include cranial nerve number 2, 9, and 10, which you guys can see kind of branching into the salivary glands and eyes. And then the really, really important one that I mentioned previously as well is nerve number 10, also known as the vagus nerve, which is extremely important. You can see the number of branching that vagus nerve has, and it is effects on the overall activity of the parasympathetic nervous system. We also have part of the sacral involved in this process. So sacral nerve 2, 3, and 4 are also involved in creating a rest and digest response when it comes to the digestive system, genitalia, and urinary bladder. Now, let's take a look at this. If you are to focus on this PowerPoint and understand the most important aspect of it in terms of neurotransmitter and then receptors and the target tissue, this would be your best picture. So first of all, what you need to understand is when you're comparing the sympathetic parasympathetic nervous system, you always start with the central nervous system. So you have a neuron that is initiating from the central nervous system, and then creates or communicates with the secondary neuron through the ganglion. Again, if you don't remember what ganglion was, please refer back to the previous PowerPoint for the central nervous system. So here is the first thing that you need to notice. Both of these neurons that are originating from the central nervous system at the ganglion position, they both releasing the neurotransmitter ACH. We talked about ACH earlier in the lecture. ACH is the neurotransmitter acetylcholine that are being released. Again, doesn't matter if you're talking about sympathetic or parasympathetic. Both of these are releasing at the ganglion neurotransmitter ACH. What is the receptor they're interacting, which is depicted as these purple box here? Those would be your nicotinic receptors. So up to this point, if you're doing a comparison between sympathetic and parasympathetic, they are identical. There is no difference. They both originate from CNS. They both release the neurotransmitter into the ganglion. And the interactions of those neurotransmitters are with receptors referred to as the nicotinic receptors. Now, the second neuron is where the difference comes from. If you're talking about the sympathetic nervous system, the neurotransmitter that is being released is known as norepinephrine. And the norepinephrine binds to the target tissue receptors identified as adrenergic receptors. Please do note that the adrenergic receptors, there are two main types, alpha and beta, and I'll show you these later on, again, as we go through the PowerPoint. On the other hand, what we have when we talk about parasympathetic nervous system, your postsynaptic neuron, which is this one, is releasing ACH. So again, look at the color coding. You still have ACH as your neurotransmitter. Now, in this case, the receptors are not nicotinic on the target tissue. They are muscarinic receptors. So a couple of major changes that you need to kind of mark for yourself in terms of differences is when you compare the neurotransmitter norepinephrine versus ACH. That's one difference. The target of the receptors, adrenergic receptor versus muscarinic receptors. So this is the two main differences you see. And then if you're looking at the similarities would be highlighted by the neurotransmitter being shared. Is the same thing, nicotinic receptors, sorry, ACH, and the receptors being the nicotinic receptors at the ganglia. So these are the typical exam questions in terms of what is the difference between the two branches, what are the similarities between the two branches. So here is the same picture, depiction of the sympathetic branch. You have the activity and the release of ACH within the ganglia, and ACH causes the release of norepinephrine, NE is norepinephrine. You have it shorthanded right here. And the receptors in this case they're depicting is alpha receptors. What are the possible targets? You already should know when we talk about autonomic nervous system, the targets are either a smooth muscle. Your second option is cardiac muscle. And the third option would be your glands. Now again, we don't go and discuss every single one of these, but you will get an idea of some of the main targets and some of the main changes you will see when you're comparing the two branches. Now, in terms of the sympathetic nervous system, you also have involvement of a gland that sits right on top of the kidneys. These pyramid-like organs that sits right on top of it, top of the kidneys, are referred to as the adrenal gland. Now, adrenal gland has two sections. The more superficial aspect of the adrenal gland is referred to as the adrenal cortex, and the inner deep aspect of it, which is right here in the darker brown color, is referred to as the adrenal medulla. Adrenal medulla is part of the nervous system. It has neurons that are coming into it. These are the sympathetic neurons or presynaptic neurons associated with the sympathetic branch. And when they get to the adrenal medulla, they cause the release of the epinephrine into your blood vessels. Epinephrine can again go and target its tissues. It can bind to the beta receptors that is depicted here. You don't need to know there's two different types of beta receptors. But again, notice that this would still be cardiac muscle, smooth muscles, glands, which are basically exocrine or endocrine, and adipose tissue, which is still identified as one of the main targets. Parasympathetic branch, again, we discussed in the first picture, release of ACH from the first one, binding to nicotinic receptors. Second neuron or postsynaptic neuron releases ACH still, but instead it's binding to the muscarinic receptors. The target, look at them guys, they're identical to what we mentioned. It's still a smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, it's still glands, regardless of if they're endocrine or exocrine, and adipose tissue. So again, we'll go through this as we review the PowerPoint. I really don't need you guys to know anything specific about this picture because we have charts and tables and I'm gonna go over that in just a minute. This picture just is really good because it brings everything into one place, but it also has information that are not necessary for what you guys are going to be tested on. One thing that is repeated in this picture is the branching of the nervous system, kind of highlighting the cranial nerves, as well as the sacral nerves that are associated with the parasympathetic, what's depicted in blue, and then the thoracic nerves and the lumbar nerves that are associated with the sympathetic branch of the nervous system. So all I'm saying is this picture is basically the same picture we have described on this slide. So let's go ahead and take a look at the charts of the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Follow me on this. I am going to scratch some of the information that is present here, as this information might be more than what you guys are required to know for the exam for this class. So follow me on that. So a couple of information before we get started. SA node and AV node. So if I'm drawing a heart, here is the right side of my heart and the chambers. And what you have inside of this heart, you have these nodular structure. The top one is referred to as the SA node, and this one is referred to as the AV node. And these two are responsible for creating electrical impulses that leads to basically your heart rate. So if, for instance, there is an increase in SA node, that's equal to increase your heart rate, and vice versa. If there is a decrease in SA node or AV node, I should say, then there is an increase in the electrical conduction. So basically, if I want to increase my heart rate and the rate of the electrical conduction within the heart, I'm going to target the SA node and the AV node. If I want to slow down the conduction and the number of heart rates or heartbeats, then I will suppress or slow down the SA node and the AV node. So we are going to use these two resources, which are basically creating electrical impulses and setting up the number of heartbeats within your body and controlling them using the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches. So let's start with sympathetic. When you have a fight or flight response, the sympathetic nervous system targets both the SA node and the AV node, what we depicted here, and that causes increase in heart rate, so you need to know that, and increase in the conduction velocity. Again, all that means is that the heart is going to create more electrical impulses, and those electrical impulses are going to spread through the heart more rapidly. Both of these imply that your heart rate is going to increase in numbers, which is logical because if you're dealing with a fight or flight response, you would like to have a higher heartbeat. Reverse that for parasympathetic, your heart rate will decrease and the conduction velocity also decreases. Force of contraction is another aspect of the effect. There is an increase in contraction of the heart, so heart is going to squeeze more or tighter or harder, pushing more blood out. But do notice that the parasympathetic does not have a significant change when it's compared. So the effect is not overall big. I don't need you guys to know that these are the beta receptors. Don't really care. Again, it gets a lot more complicated than what I want you guys to know. The blood vessels of the effect of the autonomic nervous system on blood vessels is a lot more complicated than I want you guys to know. What I really do want you guys to know is that there is the target, a main target of this would be your skeletal muscle, and depending on the regions of the skeletal muscle, it can cause vasoconstriction or vasodilation. Again, I don't want you guys to know the details about this, so you can basically skip this. Sorry, before you skip the whole thing, one quick note, the parasympathetic nervous system, there is absolutely no effect on the blood vessels. So sympathetic, there is variation, but parasympathetic has no effect, basically. Your lungs. Understand if you're dealing with a fight or flight response, typically you also want to increase your the oxygen level in your bloodstream, so to make sure that your body is receiving oxygen and therefore is able to produce its energy. So what is happening? You are targeting bronchial muscles. Bronchial muscles are basically muscles that are wrapped around the air passageway. And the contraction and relaxation of these muscles, so if this is my air passageway, there's muscles literally wrapped around this. And these muscles, contraction and relaxation, can change the airflow through the air passageway. So when you're dealing with the sympathetic nervous system, these muscles that are around your air passageway are going to relax, and they cause the air passageway to open up. So the diameter is more, and that allows, again, more air basically to pass through. You don't need to know bronchial glands. So you guys literally can draw a line on this, not necessary for you guys to know. Now, when you look at the bronchial muscle during parasympathetic nervous system, in comparison, the air passageway is usually smaller in diameter through the contraction of these muscles. You also don't need to know the receptors are beta or alpha. Digestive tract. This is a common one. If you're looking at the motility of the digestive system, is basically you're trying to digest your food and moving it alongside the alimentary canal. So when you're dealing with the sympathetic nervous system, again, your goal is not to digest your food, so the motility decreases, which makes sense. Secretion of the glands, including pancreas and lubricating fluid and mucus within the digestive system, is inhibited. You really, again, don't care about that. And I don't want to talk about the sphincters because we really have not discussed the sphincters, so we can ignore this completely. Now, when you are dealing with the parasympathetic nervous system, logically, parasympathetic is called rest and digest, which means you're going to have a significant motility for the digestive tract, and the secretion of the mucus and other component that helps with the digestive process is increased. Pancreas. The component that I do want you guys to know is associated with the exocrine function, which basically means release of the digestive enzymes that helps with the process of basically digestion or mechanical breakdown. Chemical breakdown. So again, if you're dealing with a fight or flight response, you really don't care if your food is being digested. So all of the digestive enzyme secretion is inhibited, versus when you're dealing with the rest and digest, the secretion is stimulated. Salivary gland, I don't need you guys to know because, again, you really don't have details about the salivary gland as much, so you can skip this. Kidneys, you can skip that because, again, not that it's not important, but because we haven't really had a chance to talk about them, I'm going to skip those. Same thing with urinary bladder, you can skip these. Male and female reproductive system, it is interesting, but again, limited knowledge makes it harder for me to describe them in detail. Skin. And that's interesting. Sweat glands, the stimulation of the sweat is increased in both of these. Um, erector pili muscles. These are the ones that are located at the base of the hair, and basically going to give you goosebumps. So kind of think about when you're scared or you're stressed, you have it typically that your hair is standing up. So that is stimulated or causing muscle contraction. But when you're sitting and relaxing, the hairs are just kind of lying down on the surface of the skin, and therefore there is no effect on these muscles in parasympathetic. Iris of the eye is a big one. So if you're looking at the eye, here is the pupil. Right immediately around the pupil, you have a set of muscles of the iris called circular muscles. And then around that, you have another muscle that is called the radial muscles. So circular muscles and radial muscle. When you are dealing with a sympathetic nervous system, the radial muscles are going to be engaged. And what they're going to do is they're literally going to pull on the pupil. Imagine these muscles are pulling, and that causes the pupil size to be wide open. So pupil gets bigger as these muscles are contracting, okay? Now, when you are relaxing, you really don't want to allow a lot of light to come to your eyes. So in this case, your pupil size decreases by you using the circular muscles that is around the pupil, and literally kind of think about them, the circular muscles turning and making the pupil size smaller. So both muscles are present. Pupil size is in average is, let's say, is about this size. When you are rest and digesting, so parasympathetic nervous system, the pupil size gets smaller. And when you are dealing with the sympathetic, your pupil size is wide open. Radial muscle during the fight or flight, circular muscle during the parasympathetic or rest and digest. Ciliary muscles, we'll talk about this. I don't need you to know it right now, but as we go through the PowerPoint for the senses, that becomes clear. I'm not going to talk about liver again, so you can skip that one as well. And then adipose tissue. I want you guys to understand this, why this is there. Again, when you're dealing with a stressful situation, a lot of times what you need is energy, right? Let's say you want to fight somebody, you want to run away from them, you need energy. So one of the first things that you want to get, and is easy resources for you, is your fat, right? So when you hear the word lipolysis, that basically means breaking down what? Fat, right? So when you may need energy and your body thinks you may need energy, you are stimulating the breakdown of fat. However, again, when you're digesting food, you really don't want to start breaking down your fat, that is your storage of energy. So there is no effect in that case. Last topic we want to talk about is regeneration of the nerve fibers associated with peripheral nervous system. This is a very basic overview of this, guys. I'm not going to go into details about it. Couple of points you need to know for this. If the neuron in the peripheral nervous system, the damage is localized to the cell body, the chances the cell will die. Because cell body contains your nucleus, your organelles, and basically most of the functionalities of the neuron depends on the cell body, including production of neurotransmitter. However, if the damage is more localized to the axon and the cell body is intact, there's a really good chance that neuron can regenerate. How does it do that? First thing, that after the damage of the axon is done, the axon is going to seal itself because it doesn't want to expose itself to the external environment or to your extracellular fluid. The components that are damaged are getting destroyed or disintegrated as a result of lack of nutrients and oxygen. Now, there are cells that are going to come and clean this up. These are a category of white blood cells called macrophages that they're going to literally engulf the disintegrated parts of the axon and destroy them by fragmenting them. Now, the Schwann cells, which are the cells that were responsible for creating the myelin sheath in your peripheral nervous system, come in and localize within the site of the damage, and they start to release what we identify as growth factors. These growth factors are creating what we identified as a tube near the region that the axon is damaged, and that tube, that new tube that is created by Schwann cells and the growth factors, allows the axon to be fully developed. And after the axon is generated, you wrap it with the Schwann cells and form your myelin sheath. Sorry, there is a TH. So here is basically the picture. Your neuron is sealing itself as is here. Here is the site of the damage. These cells that you see right here in purple, these are your macrophages coming and destroying and getting rid of the unwanted material. These cells that are coming around, these are your Schwann cells, and they are creating the tube using, basically they're creating a tube that allows the axon to start to grow. So here's your axon starting to form. Here's your axon fully forming, and the surrounding of the axon is your myelin sheath. Again, is it that simple? Of course not, but this is the level of understanding I do want you guys to know. So that is about it for our peripheral nervous system. We'll continue our next lecture with special senses, describing the function of the eye and looking at phototransduction.